and thank you for listening to the first ever episode of A Clinician a Click Away.
Hi, good morning. Morning, Ed.
Morning, mate. Morning, Fran.
Morning, everyone. How are we?
Good.
Excellent. So this is a production by the team at Umbo, and in this episode we're going to be talking about the best way to do good, whether or not it's as a charity or as a social enterprise. And it seems that everyone understands what a charity is, what the point of a charity is, and why you might like to work for one. But when it comes to something like a social enterprise, which we at Umbo are, there's a lot more confusion. So we're going to talk about why Umbo is a social enterprise and not a charity, and what the implications are for our work at Umbo. So hi, I'm Francesca Pinzone, your host for today, and joining me on this episode of A Clinician a Click Away are my two Umbo co-founders, Wei Yo and Ed Johnson.
Good morning again. It's very exciting.
Good morning. Great to be here.
Excellent. Glad to have you guys along. Okay, so let's start. So firstly, I think it's good to know a little bit about each of us. So Wei, let's start with you. Most of your experiences in charity work. Can you give it a bit of a rundown of what you've done?
Yeah, most of my background started off doing physio. Then I spent a bit of time in Vietnam volunteering in an orphanage, which worked out to not be a great experience for anyone. And then I studied international development and also worked in a charity in Australia, in a very small charity here. And I got this amazing job when I finished my Master's in International Development going to China. And I was working in this system where I really saw a lot of the problems of charities. And just to summarize briefly, I think a lot of it is around charities perpetuating themselves and being able to say, look, we need more funding to do more work, but actually not really having a good sense of whether or not that work is any good and helps people, but also knowing when that work's going to stop. So actually I left China quite disillusioned and then moved to Cambodia on a bit of a whim, and then started OIC Cambodia, which is a charity that's now going there, run by local people, and I go back to visit every now and then. And then now back to Australia with Umbo and with you guys doing that. So yeah, predominantly it's been charity, and learning about social enterprise is quite a new thing for me. Not so much for you.
No. So thanks for that.
Smooth segue.
Very smooth. I like it. So yeah, I guess my background is a little bit similar, and it's quite interesting how we've all somehow converged together, I think. So working kind of in the health system as a registered nurse for a number of years, and then undertaking a Masters of International Public Health, which led me to work in charities and in kind of larger scale charities like Doctors Without Borders or Médecins Sans Frontières, and doing kind of real grassroots work there, and also with UNICEF in India for a little while, I guess. And then I was very, very fortunate to come back and work in a relatively kind of medium-sized non-profit organisation or charity here in Australia called Canteen. And that was great because I got to really see a longer-term impact of what it looks like when you work with young people or any kind of beneficiary to get a really good outcome. And so, and now to Umbo here. And I've worked a lot in the social impact space, so I can see the different sides and why there is a real need for social enterprise, particularly around being able to be a little bit more agile in the way that social enterprises work and around their kind of risk appetite as well, and not maybe always so reliant on funding, but looking at different opportunities to grow and scale because you're using business models in terms of, rather than just kind of working off the waiting for grants and donations. So I think it's really interesting we're having this conversation today. And before we move on to it, I think we really need to hear from Ed though, because Ed's our kind of subject matter expert around our delivery, isn't it?
Oh, hopefully. I'm Ed Johnson. I started my university career studying linguistics, and that led me into speech pathology. And I really had always had a big appetite to help people, to make a difference in the world. And I also love rural Australia. So I moved out to central west New South Wales as soon as I'd finished uni, and began working out there, and worked in a variety of different contexts, different clinical contexts, and kind of moved further and further west, as I continued to practice. But from early on, I noticed that what was happening in allied health, even though we said we wanted to put the person first, that the person was often, put a long way down the list of priorities, and they were, being dictated to in terms of what kind of therapies we would do with them, what their goals were in life, and I really wanted to change that. So that led me to some research, which I'm hopefully going to finish in the next few months in my PhD, which is looking at how we can deliver a person-centred approach to people living in the bush, and to make sure that they get the same opportunities that everyone in big cities in Australia and around the world get, because they live in the same country, and they should be afforded the same opportunities, I believe. So that's what kind of led me here today.
So, Wei, I guess you're probably best placed to answer this. The difference between a charity or a social enterprise, what is it?
Yeah, it's interesting when you say to someone that, I work in a charity, and everyone kind of goes, oh, okay, I know what that means to a certain extent. And when you say social enterprise, just because it's such a new form, and also in Australia, generally speaking, there's no legal difference between a social enterprise and a company as far as things like tax are concerned and structure. People don't really understand what social enterprise is. So a charity is something that is a organisation that's not owned by anyone. So it has members, but not shareholders. So the members are owning the organisation in a way, but they're not actually financially benefiting from it. And then you have directors, and then you have staff, etc. And a social enterprise is structured like a company, so it has shareholders, but somewhere in the constitution it has to say that we exist primarily for social purpose, so to make the world a better place. And often there's something else about the use of the profit. So the Pro Bono Law Association says 50% plus profits have to be reinvested back into the charity to do more, into the social enterprise to do more socially good work, or given to another charity, essentially outsourcing their social work.
Okay, so it's a business with a purpose, basically.
Yeah, it's business, and I think you said something really interesting before when we were just getting ready, that even the term non-profit is sort of a little bit outdated in a way. And what's the term that you used again?
For-purpose organisations.
Yeah, so for-purpose organisations would then encompass charities and social enterprises. Yeah. And I think putting them under the same umbrella actually makes a lot more sense, right?
Well, I guess it's looking at, is our purpose for our shareholders or is our purpose for our stakeholders? And I think that's a really important distinction around, why are we here and what's our business, trying to achieve.
Yeah.
So how does a social enterprise do good then?
Yeah, so there's two primary ways in which social enterprises can do good. One of them is through the running of the actual enterprise itself. So, for example, we ethically source our tea leaves so that we know and that the farmers are getting paid a decent wage and they're able to feed their families well, as opposed to ripping them off. And the other way is through the use of the profits. So we donate our profit or a portion of the profit to probably a charity that then does the actual social work. And neither is necessarily better or worse than the other method. With the first method, through the actual running of the business, you have more control over how the socially good work is done. But when you donate the profit and you're essentially outsourcing it to a charity, you have less control. So it's just a little bit more opaque. It's not quite as easy to see what actually happens with that money. And then there's probably question marks around, that actual charity itself, like how good they are, whether or not they're doing the right thing, etc.
Yeah. And do those charities, are they required to be part of the ACNC registration or not?
Well, strictly speaking, no, because as a social enterprise, I could just give to whomever I like. And that's another thing about social enterprises as opposed to charities. And, we've all worked with charities, so we know this issue around when you work in a charity, there's just so much scrutiny about where you can spend your money. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but it does make life quite difficult. So the classic example that everyone knows in the charity sector is, we only want you to spend money on the program, or we only want you to spend money on activities that end up putting people in better positions in their life. So we don't want you to hire staff, so stuff just magically happens without people. We don't want you to spend money on an office because you just do it in your bedroom. So all of these sorts of things that you need to actually run any organisation, regardless of whether it's a business or non-profit. You can't do that as a charity. And that's why a lot of charities are really hamstrung when they come to how they want to deliver social impact. And social enterprises have a lot more freedom. because you can run it like a company, and you can pick and choose who you give to without a lot of scrutiny. There's a whole lot of other issues that come up from that, I guess, but ultimately there's more freedom to move.
Yeah. I can't tell you the amount of times when I worked in a non-profit or in the sector for about 10 years where people asked me if I was volunteering for those 10 years, working full weeks and not getting paid for it, which I thought was interesting. I think it's also that when we apply for grants in the non-profit sector, often you're not allowed to include on costs or people costs as part of that, which kind of, I think the sector is now moving, which is great, and the philanthropic sector is now moving towards obviously accounting for that, but traditionally it's been not acceptable to use people costs as part of your grant money, which I find really interesting.
Well, I mean,
who's doing the work?
Exactly, and one thing you have to ask is, and probably throw back to you guys, is how many people do you know who have worked in non-profit and have actually made it work financially? So how many people can actually work in the non-profit sector for a sustainable period of time and not rely on a wealthy partner or parents or something? Do you know? I don't know of any that have done it more than 5 to 10 years.
I know a few, but I think it really depends on the organisation and whether they have moved with this kind of sense of we're a business, really, and we need to operate like a business, and therefore we need to remunerate our staff appropriately. I think that because a lot of kind of organisations, I've got a lot of friends who are in the non-profit sector, and they're finding that their organisations are moving that way, and therefore they are being remunerated appropriately for their skills and experience. But I think, traditionally it's tricky. It's very hard,
That makes me think of the trend of younger people looking for more purpose in their employment these days. And I don't know if we know if there are more young people who are looking to start social enterprise, or also in addition to that, perhaps older investors who are looking to invest in businesses that have purpose rather than just looking at financial gain for themselves.
So that's an interesting question, which is that if social enterprises are new structures that are doing good, are they replacing charities or are they replacing businesses, or are they doing both? But which one are they doing more of, right? So there's a danger, I think, if social enterprises replace charities, first of all, because the social enterprises run on good business models, and that's how you do good. But sometimes there is not a good business model to do good. There's just no way you can actually run a social enterprise where a charity existed previously. And one example I think about quite a bit is homelessness, as an example. I just don't know how you would, maybe I'm just naive, but I'm not sure how you'd be able to run a business in that sector without propping it up with external funding, a la charity. But if social enterprises are replacing businesses, that's a different story. Purely for-profit businesses, that stereotypically purely capitalist businesses, that's not a bad thing. That's a really great thing. In terms of young people, there's an interesting book that I just finished reading called iGen, lowercase I, capital G. And it's based on stuff in the States. And, everyone kind of says, the young people are the most purpose-led generation, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, not so much the case. So millennials, yay, millennials, are the most purpose-led generation. And then with this new generation of people born after 1995, they're actually going back to being more profit-driven and more interested in finances than in doing good. And the question is partly why. And I think part of the answer is because the world that they're growing up in is a lot more unstable, even financially, than the world that we grew up in. We grew up in a time of plenty. And I think at the moment things are a little bit shaky, particularly financially. So we've actually kind of regressed a little bit in that way. The other interesting one is that one about the data. I'm sure, Fran, you know this one, talking about trends with young people in terms of how they do good. And so to simplify a little bit, in Australia, what they're seeing is the trend is people are less likely to give money to a charity, but they're more likely, younger people, but they're more likely to buy ethical products. I think they're less likely to volunteer, but they're more likely to want to work for a company that has good social values. So we're changing the nature and the way in which we want to do good. I think people have always wanted to do good, but we're changing the way in which we're doing it, and that has real implications.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're thinking about social enterprise and charity, like, is there one better than the other? Does one method work, or one kind of business organisation work better than the other?
Well, clearly for our case, we know, or we think, that running it as a social enterprise makes better. So I think it makes more sense. I think it's more of a courses for horses kind of situation, where in certain ways, in certain situations, a charity works better. In certain situations, a social enterprise works better. So there are advantages of both and disadvantages of both. In my personal experience, having run a charity and started one right from the beginning and then tried to keep it going, it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating, and it's very limiting. And there's just so many things you want to do, but you just can't do them. And I think, to summarize, you spend a lot of time fundraising.
Yeah.
And then you spend a lot of time reporting on that fundraising. And then you sort of look at your week and you go, when do I actually get time to do the work? Right? So you're just getting the resources, and then you're talking about why you should get more resources. And that's a big problem for charities. Now, social enterprises have other problems, but they don't have that problem, I think. What do you guys think?
I was just wondering if you have an opinion on whether government realises how much work goes into the tendering processes for these kind of grants that charities go for, and the kind of effect that has, and even the kind of often the length of the grant, whether it's for 6-12 months or for 5 years, and the kind of effect that has on the ability to suit the market, or suit the people who you're trying to serve.
And I think it's getting better, and I'm sure Fran would agree with that. Like, it's getting better, but it's a long way to go. I'll give you one quick example. On LinkedIn, I saw this post that this lady put up, which was really illustrative of the whole problem. So she said, this is not government, mind you, this is a foundation. So the foundation were boasting about the number of applicants that they had to this grant, and they said something like, we had 250 applicants to this grant, and they gave out 3 or 4 lots of $20,000. And then she said, all right, well, let's do an analysis of this. So 200 plus organisations, let's say X number of staff are spending time, Y number of hours writing these applications. Let's say, for example, that the staff are being paid, Z number of dollars per hour. Let's total up all that opportunity cost of time that's been associated with writing these grants and applying, and etc. And then she said, as a sector, the charity sector has just lost about 150 grand this whole exercise, because only 60 grand has been given out, right? So I think that's a fair question. Is what's the point of all of this if we actually lose? It's a net loss, and that's never discussed. It's just, well, it's great if you win and you win this tendering and grant process, and of course those people can go on and do certain things, but as a sector we just lose. I don't really see what the point of it is.
I think it's around organisations being really strategic in the kind of types of grants that they're willing to consider. On the flip side, when I worked at Canteen, excuse me, we had a really interesting, just as I was leaving Canteen, we won a grant for $1.5 million over 3 years, and that was incredible because and that was from a foundation, and it just showed a real kind of insight into trying to do good, but you need money and you need time, and that gave us ample opportunity to be able to really bring that kind of the organisational objective and the introduction of this new program. It gave us a lot of time and decent investment to be able to move that forward and grow that program over 3 years, rather than it being a 1 year or small grant. But there is place for smaller grants, I think, as well. In the sector, if you just need kind of there's a couple that we've applied for at Umbo that I think would be really valuable around helping us transition certain things within the NDIS, $20,000 in order to do that. There's a good place for some of those types of grants. So I guess that is one of the, are social enterprises eligible for these types of philanthropic grants, either being government or from foundations? Or are we finding that there's a limit on what we can apply for funding access as a social enterprise rather than a charity?
Yeah, so that's changing. So more and more places are opening up funding to social enterprises. More and more companies are opening up their staff to volunteer with social enterprises too, but not all. So there's some even young organisations who do volunteering where they won't allow you to do it if it's a social enterprise. So I think it comes back to that problem, though, about fundamentally we don't actually have one accepted definition of what a social enterprise is. So we have different groups that are saying certain things. In the UK, they say something that's quite specific. But in Australia, we just don't really have this one idea of what it is. But for social enterprises, it's the same as any company that's starting out. You do need a little bit of a boost to actually get going. And I guess the other advantage of social enterprises is that might not just be funding as in grants, but it could also be investment as well, right? So if someone really believes in the work that you're doing, then you can also take on investment and they can get a financial return, hopefully, assuming that you're able to return that at some stage. But then the question's around, well, who would give and who would invest? So you've got a range of people that might put money towards a cause, ranging from a VC, a venture capitalist, who's very, very interested in financial return perhaps, and then you've got a philanthropist on the other side. And for a social enterprise, a philanthropist is someone who just purely gives and doesn't expect any financial return. For a social enterprise looking for investment, you're somewhere in the middle, I think. You're looking somewhere in the middle for someone who is interested in some financial return, but also is probably more interested in the social return. Now with Umbo, my personal opinion is we're looking more towards the philanthropy side, because I don't think necessarily this idea, although unless you guys are holding some information that I don't know, is going to be a huge money spinner at the end of the day. I think it's primarily here to deliver social benefit. And that's one of the things social enterprises early on have to make a decision about. You have to work out at the beginning, and we did very early, are we here primarily to make profit and then just do a bit of good as well? Or are we here primarily to do good and then probably make a bit of profit for our investors as well?
So how does Umbo make money?
Oh, you tell me. You're looking after the money.
Well, I guess we're a fee-for-service model, correct? So, our clients, families, pay money but for the service that we deliver. But I guess it's that, do we currently invest, we currently invest 100% of our profits back into the running of our business, whether that will continue in that same way in the long term. But I guess that's what defines us as a social enterprise, right? That we're putting that profit back into the business, but we're using this fee-for-service model in order to generate revenue.
And it depends where that funding for the fees come from, I guess. So, of course, with us, we are NDIS registered, as I'm sure you're well aware. We are NDIS registered, so if there's a source of funding that's stable and can then help us to impact lives of families that are vulnerable, i.e. those that are rural and remote, or families of kids with disabilities and so on, then that to me quantifies as a really good business model if it works.
Yeah, and I think that's probably where we do weigh up that social good versus earning money. We're looking at helping the more vulnerable people in our communities. And those are the people who don't have the money to pay up front. They can't pay big hourly rates for therapists. They can't pay big travel costs. We're often getting NDIS funding or funding from third parties to help these people. So we're going down that road of really wanting to make an impact socially, rather than for our own hip pocket, I think.
So can we talk about NDIS for a second and Bill Bush?
Next, yeah.
So NDIS is a National Disability Insurance Scheme, is a scheme that's essentially creating a free market approach to disability services, but it would be fair to say in the 5 or so years it's been around, there's been a lot of market failure in the bush. So it's actually a question probably more for Ed. So then the response has been a lot from the government throwing money towards providers to try and make up for that market failure. What's the future for social enterprise then? Because social enterprise is based upon a successful open market. Does that make it harder for social enterprises like us to enter the space? Is there a future for us if we take a purely market approach?
Interesting question. And there's probably a few different perspectives you could take on it. The one, purely pragmatic answer would be that it's a great opportunity because there are people out there who want help. They're looking for support, and if you can be the people there to help them, then there's an opportunity to help them and at the same time build your business. So there's that opportunity, but there's also a lot of debate around the processes and the level of bureaucracy involved in becoming registered with NDIS, and depending on the size of your organisation, whether you're certified or whether you have to be verified, or the whole audit process is an extensive one, very stressful.
Is it,
one,
Fern?
Yeah, a little bit.
But,
Having just gone through it.
So a lot of businesses are kind of opting out. They might still be providing services, and there's provision for that in doing plan managed or self managed services. But there's also a lot of organisations who are travelling less, who are kind of consolidating their businesses and just kind of trying to figure out where they sit within NDIS at the moment, which means there's a lot of change for people and a lot of changing relationships on a personal level with clients, and it's it can be quite traumatic for them, really. They've been, if they have had a service, then it might have discontinued or changed a lot, or they might be seeing different therapists and might be getting very different results. So that's been really difficult for families, I think. But also the fact that in a lot of areas the markets are failing, and people aren't seeing a kind of a value in providing services. They're not able to make it profitable. But I think there's an opportunity, and especially with our online service, there's a definite possibility to kind of prop that up.
You also shared this really interesting article. It's a little bit old now, but so old, maybe 5 months old.
Yeah.
Probably outdated. But you shared an interesting article about social enterprise and NDIS. So, what are your thoughts on that topic? We'll put those in the show notes, by the way.
Oh yes, definitely. I think it's really interesting. I think there's a real opportunity here within this NDIS space to move away from more traditional models of care and service delivery, and enable maybe kind of more smaller, kind of less risk averse. I don't know, I get this sense that, with social enterprises, you can be just that little bit more kind of, take a few more different kind of leaps and bounds into areas that maybe aren't traditionally always kind of accessed. And so, I think there's great opportunity here for us, for all social enterprises to tap into this market within the NDIS. I think it's also around navigating that space, but also helping people understand across Australia what a social enterprise is as well, and why we're here and what we're trying to do. Because we're really trying to grow our service delivery by, utilising this kind of model. It's around how can we keep increasing what we're doing, and not being kind of hamstrung by a lot of the kind of things that might sit within that non-profit side of things. I think there's a real opportunity, but we just have to make sure that the appetite, I guess, and the understanding from people is there as well of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that's a great point, Fran, and I think that's probably one of the reasons, speaking with a lot of established providers, NGOs who've worked in this area in Western New South Wales and in rural Australia in the past, pre-NDIS, they have established structures in their business, and they're simply too costly for NDIS, whereas new social enterprises can be a bit more savvy in terms of how they set themselves up, their HR, and be able to save money where the big NGOs can't.
What do you think the NDIA or government departments could do to support that growth? If social enterprises are perfectly placed to support this system that's failing a lot of people in rural areas, what could they do to help? Apart from give a lot of cash.
I was going to say they could give us some money. No, but I guess they can make the processes easier. I mean, when we think about the NDIS accreditation process that we're just
Tell us about that.
Yeah, let me tell you about that. So we have gone through, the process, and look, it's an incredible process because as a business and as a new business, it helps us streamline a lot of our processes. So a lot of the kind of HR, financial processes that we were kind of going through anyway, it's really helped ensure that the rigour is behind those. And so that's been really good. But, you know, the difference between whether an organisation with 200 employees or 2,000 employees and an organisation with 3 employees going through that process, it's not much different. And I think that's the problem, because your expectation and the capacity for an organisation to undertake that, which is an organisation that's small, that's growing, that's really trying to tap into a different market, compared to one of the huge kind of disability service providers, it doesn't make sense.
How many policies and procedures do we?
I think 80 something policies and procedures
for a staff load of 4.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So you know that's a lot of effort and a lot of energy. And I think when you look at the time and opportunity cost, so the cost of us actually going through the accreditation process was relatively high for a small organisation, but also the staff time that it took us to develop a lot of those processes. And like I said, a lot of them we were required anyway, but it's really just, understanding that that's a lot of investment.
It is, and we did an analysis just for our listeners about the opportunity cost and actual cost of paying for audits, and I think the net loss to the organisation is about $30,000 plus dollars, that we have yet to recoup even a slight amount of that from the NDIS. So hopefully we will eventually, but that's one other thing, just to tie it back to the original topic and maybe get off the NDIS whinge fest, because otherwise we'll be here for a couple of hours. Just to talk about the social enterprise is that when you commit to doing something for socially good, it's very easy and tempting perhaps to stray away from that. So it's very easy for social enterprises to take the easy route, which is to be more like a traditional company rather than to be like a charity. And you see some like that, I think, where they face barriers, because it is hard. And you look at your cohort of people that are doing stuff that are purely capitalist, essentially, and you kind of think, well, maybe we'll just take that route. And a lot of it's justified. So one of the quandaries perhaps is we exist to provide speech and occupational therapy to families that are in rural areas. But if we're finding it difficult to get into that area for a number of different reasons, would it be wrong for us to go and market heavily towards a wealthy community, for example, in the eastern suburbs of Sydney? I mean, you could argue, one argument would be, no, well, that's totally not what a social enterprise should be doing. But a counter argument will be, well, actually, maybe it is, because if we make that succeed and we're able to gain profit from that, maybe we can reinvest that profit or subsidise payments for people that are in rural areas. Or, more importantly, maybe the business stays afloat and then we're able to do good work in the future. So I think these kinds of questions are really interesting in social enterprises, and there's no real right or wrong answer.
Yeah, well, I think historically, just as a little personal anecdote, I think that's how the public health system got going, is that doctors went out there and they charged, maybe 20% of their patients who could afford to see a doctor, and then they'd work in a hospital and see the rest of the 80% of the population for free, and that's how people were able to access healthcare. So I think for me it resonates with that, and the way that we're kind of not kind of a Robin Hood type analogy, but getting help from the people who can afford it to prop up the business, and then going and using that help to help other people who can't necessarily afford services day to day.
Yeah. So I've got a couple more questions. I think we think that there's been any trade-offs because we've become a social enterprise rather than a charity as an organisation? Like, besides, I guess, applicability to a lot of funding opportunities, which I think as a social enterprise you maybe don't have access to. Are there any other trade-offs that we can think of as a social enterprise rather than being a charity?
I think the main one is pretty much what you said, is that the ability to fundraise. So you can, if you go through the right hoops as a charity, so OIC Cambodia, the one that I started in Cambodia, we just registered OIC Australia here, and we're now gone through all the right hoops to be able to take donations and issue tax deductible receipts. That's basically the last step. So to be able to do that, you then can go to the public and go to companies and corporations and whatever and say, we would like you to give. But of course, there's a lot of time associated with that and a lot of reporting. So it's a question mark around whether or not it's A, able to be done, but B, whether or not it's actually really worth it. But I think the other thing about trade-offs between the two structures is that there's nothing stopping us from registering a charity later anyway, which could be this existing one, because that's the route that it takes. You register a company first, then you register a charity, or it could be a separate structure. I'm really for the idea, and we did it in Cambodia, of having separate entities, one for-profit, one non-profit, and what that does is it separates a lot of the risk as well, but it really opens you up to be able to do different things, right? Because as we've sort of been through, you can do some things as a non-profit and you can do some things as a social enterprise. Why not have both? It's probably not something for right now because it's a fair bit of work behind it, but when things are moving a little bit further, that could be something we do in the future.
One other trade-off that I was thinking about is, and I know this because I know you, I don't think it'll matter too much to you, but what about public perception? And not just on an individual level, but public perception of a company that is for profit rather than not for profit.
You obviously know well enough. I don't really. I think that so you have two choices. Getting a bit philosophical now. You have two choices in the world. You either and it's not as black and white as I'm about to say, but you either adapt to the world around you, or you try and change the world into the way that you want to see it. So I think we have a duty, if we believe that social enterprises are a viable way of helping people, to actually educate people and tell them why and explain why, and then also explain why the other model perhaps doesn't suit. And also not to be because I'm really against the notion that charity founders and people who work in charities have to be pariahs and have to really sacrifice everything and be volunteers, because what that does is it really does a disservice to the amount of education that we have, and the amount of experience we have, and the amount of study and effort and time. If we just completely go, we're basically volunteers that are we're basically like Mother Teresa, we're volunteers, then it takes away the whole professionalism. So I think what's better is to actually try and do it the way that we want to do it, but also to have that discussion and tell people what it really means. It's having these awkward. I mean, how do you explain it when
I think it's interesting because that thought of volunteering and that you put your time there, and this need to sacrifice everything. There's 56,000 charities in Australia. It's a huge part of our economic sector as well. So you do a little bit of a disservice when you start to kind of just think about that as a doing good, as opposed to actually running well. I think. I don't know. I think it's interesting around social enterprise, and I think there's just so many opportunities that we need to help people understand what the benefit of being a social enterprise can be. I do think that there are so many incredible social enterprises out there that are doing incredible things, and things always spring to mind. Like you think about the Bread and Butter Project, and Street, and what they're doing and how they're helping. And yes, they might start off, on a smaller scale, but the opportunity is so good to tap into a market that you just maybe can't see if you're a non-profit, organisation potentially, or that it's just a little bit easier perhaps at times. So I think it's an ongoing discussion and an ongoing, I don't know, looking at what happens, looking at what's happened and where we're going forward.
And it's interesting, I mean, you mentioned the number of non-profits, 56,000, and I was just thinking in my head, I wonder how many social enterprises are out there, but actually do we have any data on that?
Well, I don't know, because, I mean, I should know this, but, Swinburne University is doing some incredible things with social enterprises, and I think it's, worth investigating further and trying to understand what's out there, what's happening. There's great tools and, ways to measure your social impact and impact investment. All that stuff is being discussed and talked about. So I think it's really worth kind of us keeping, and that's what we're trying to do, keep on top of what's happening within this little niche sector within, our for-purpose system.
I'm just wondering, though, if there is no legal structure accepted of a social enterprise, how is that data being collected, or is it just best guesses at this stage?
I'm not sure, but I think that's something we can definitely find out more about.
Because it's not like, and again, this would be great in the future to have like a place that you have to register as a social enterprise. And I mean, there's a B Corp thing, so B Corporation, which suggests that you are a social enterprise because you do fit a certain number of criteria, but not every social enterprise is also a B Corp. It's something that we would like to do or consider to do in the future, perhaps, but that's not a measure of the number of social enterprises.
No, it's not. Further info.
TBC.
TBC.
That'll be podcast number 7. We'll have it worked out by then. Right?
Okay, so I think any other kind of final thoughts? Social enterprises, Umbo, where can we go? What are we doing? What does it look like as a social enterprise?
I think it would be really nice to be able to see more social enterprises being supported within this space. I think and we will link to the article in the show notes about when I read this article, basically saying that NDIS is the perfect space for social enterprises. Of course, it's like preaching to the converted. So I'm like, yes, I get that.
We're doing the right thing.
Yeah, but it really would be nice to see that research being translated into actually policy decisions that help small social enterprises, because we know also the statistic that in New South Wales 90% of business under NDIS is being done by 25% of providers. So what that seems, and I'll put that reference in the show notes, what that seems to suggest is that as much as we want this to be a free market approach, it's not really, not at the moment. And it might have been better in the past and it might get better in the future, but right now, at the end of 2019, it's really not. It's kind of big providers are being propped up, I would say, particularly in rural and remote areas. But that takes away from the whole point of NDIS, because the whole point is choice and control. So if all you could really see are the big providers, and the smaller social enterprises particular aren't being supported to compete and to be there and to say, hey, we exist as well, then we've got a problem, I think. But the recognition of the value of social enterprises, that's where it kind of starts. So for me, Umbo is really important that we do this work, because I can see the benefit to people in rural and remote. I can see the lives being changed. We've already seen quite a lot of that evidence. But beyond that, it's about the idea behind it. It's about saying, I think, that there is a space for this kind of stuff, that there is a place for social enterprises and new ways of doing things, and innovation and new research and so on, that can actually benefit people's lives. So it's twofold. I want to see the organisation do the work to help the people, but I want to see the organisation succeed to prove the point.
Yeah, and to change the sector and the nature of the sector.
Yeah.
In a way. Yeah. And prove that, we can do it. Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for the time today, and I think our next Clinician a click away, we'll have to think of what comes next.
Okay, thanks Fran. Thanks Ed.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.